Everyone, welcome to our panel on Norwegian peace diplomacy, Now What? My name is Haakon Gjerløw and I am the acting director of the Peace Research Institute Oslo, PRIO. And every year, PRIO has a survey on Norwegians' perceptions of conflict, peace and conflict. And as many of you might guess, Norwegian fears of conflict has increased rapidly over the past years, and particularly since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This year, in our survey, 60% of the respondents, a representative sample of the country, reply that they believe that in the next decade, a new large war will erupt in Europe. Conflict is extremely expensive. It costs us in human lives, it costs us in development, it costs us in happiness, and it costs us economically. And if you do not care about the lives of others elsewhere, then you might care about the gas prices, which are now affected by conflict at the Hormuz. So in a world where conflict is increasing, what is the role for peace diplomacy, and what particularly should be the role of Norwegian peace diplomacy to help alleviate the costs of conflict? And to guide us through this conversation, we have a research director at PRIO, Kristoffer Lidén, and I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Haakon. Thanks all of you for coming. Norwegian peace diplomacy is facing a lot of public criticism these days. It is also subject to parliamentary scrutiny, and there has been a lot of attention, a lot of critical attention to a field that has for decades been veiled in secrecy. I think many of the harshest critics know the least about the topic. And rather than having a truly expert debate on this topic today, on the kind of nitty-gritties, we want to address the more fundamental questions of what do we mean with peace diplomacy. And we will center on some basic questions of what distinguishes Norwegian peace diplomacy on the international scene. Is it different from any other diplomacy? Has it ever been successful? We hear about failures, we hear about the Oslo process and so on. Has it ever truly been successful? Can we come up with some concrete examples? And what does it mean to speak of a successful example of peace diplomacy? And lastly, have recent changes to the global order made Norwegian peace diplomacy obsolete, overflødig? Has, for instance, in yesterday's panel on the political developments in the Middle East, Henrik Thune was standing on this scene and said that at this moment there is no room for peace diplomacy. The closest we can get is some sort of conflict diplomacy. So was he right? What would he mean with this? I'll leave this to a very excellent panel to discuss. With us today we have Asif Khan, Director of the Policy and Mediation Unit at the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. Perfectly situated for analyzing this question a bit from afar, but also with intimate knowledge of the subject, also Norway's role in this. We also have Ayesha Wolasmal, Foreign Affairs commentator of VG, and with long-standing experience from Afghanistan. You've also written a book on that subject of direct relevance to this discussion. Johan Wibe, Director of the Norwegian Center for Conflict Resolution, NOREF, and a former diplomat. NOREF often works in silence, with some secrecy, and we managed to bring you out of that sphere today and facing the Norwegian public. And lastly, Torunn Tryggestad, researcher and director of the Center for Gender, Peace and Security at PRIO, former deputy director at PRIO, and someone who's also worked in this field for a long time. So with this, I'll open for an open discussion. So we don't have a clear plan for this discussion. We just have the 3 questions. We don't have an agreement of who will start and end. We will open for discussion, and if the panelists are not sufficiently critical, I will try to complement them by being so. There is unfortunately not room for a Q&A, but at least we'll hopefully have a frank discussion amongst our panelists. So with this, I'll ask the first question, which is, what is particular about Norwegian peace diplomacy? How does it distinguish itself from other types of diplomacy and other peace diplomacy on the international scene? Anyone daring to start? Aisha, please.
My partner told me, do not start.
Okay.
And so, but everybody was standing so quietly. I think, you know, there are many things that I believe, having observed this field for a long time, stand out as typically sort of Norwegian, or maybe we've branded them as typically Norwegian. It's basically these long-standing, tight networks. It is the environments that we are able to create that enables a conducive environment for very, very difficult conversation, very tense conversations. And I think, you know, in a broader sense, it's also the fact that Norway, much earlier than many others, decided to speak to everybody. And that's basically the, it's a prerequisite. You can't sort of have conversation if you have very strong opinions about who you want to talk to, who you don't want to talk to. So very early on, I think, you know, Norway understood that this is a space in which that kind of service is required. I mean, you have these terror listings that the EU operates with, which inherently has a limitation on not being able to speak to the other side or to the warring parties, whereas we kind of just by permitting ourselves to access the warring parties, terrorists, call them whatever you want, that in and of itself has been a real advantage. And also, I think, you know, what makes Norway unique is that we are not exceptionally relevant in many other spaces. So it's about carving out a space where we can stand out a little bit. And that's sort of, yeah, so trust, access, communication channels, the fact that we speak to everybody, and discretion and secrecy.
Yeah, that's already a very comprehensive answer. Yeah. But I have you, Torunn, to fill in, so please.
I quite agree with Aisha, so I was thinking, what can I add here? In terms of the networks, I think what Norway has been doing over so many years and continues to do is this close collaboration with civil society. And this started out already with the Oslo process, working closely with Norwegian civil society organizations, increasingly also working with international organizations. I think this is something that distinguishes Norway from many other actors, not least the many new actors now evolving that don't have this tradition or experience working with civil society organizations. Interestingly, also, Norway has, maybe this does not distinguish Norway, but in recent years working more and more with intelligence organizations. I think this is something new, which is not much spoken about. And I know that many civil society organizations are worried about this because they see that they are less approached now, because maybe Norway gets information from other sources.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would maybe add just agree very much what has been said here already, but very value-based, I think, at least we try. And this is a difficult moment to be value-based because there's no consensus about the values any longer. But I guess we can revert to that later because there's a topic of adaptation here that we need to address. But I think also the way we play the role, we insist a lot on the fact that the ownership of the parties of the process and being sort of a weak facilitator, not someone who comes into the room and bangs his fist on the table and says, this is the solution. So, and that distinguishes us obviously from a person like Holbrooke, for example. So, yeah. And also, I think we are, ownership definitely, and inclusion, which was already mentioned also by Torunn here. But I think also we still are a bit stuck maybe in this CPA, Comprehensive Peace Accord thinking, which is sort of a thing that encompasses everything. You deal with accountability, you deal with inclusion, you deal with root causes of the conflict, etc., etc. This is something we did with the FARC agreement, for instance, which is known now, unfortunately, as maybe the last comprehensive peace agreement for the time being. But I think we are still a bit stuck in that thought because I think we need to renew ourselves. And you referred to some of the things Henrik said yesterday in his in his presentations, and Henrik Thune, and he referred a lot to this contact diplomacy that is maybe the fact of establishing channels, and where it's extremely important what Aisha mentioned, talk to everybody. And I'm concerned about that we are losing a little bit here in Norway now, the consensus around the idea of talking to everybody.
So when Henrik distinguishes between peace diplomacy and conflict diplomacy, does that make sense to you? What would you understand with that distinction?
Well, I can say there is actually a big discussion on how we should, but I think in these times, which are more of the realists, conflict diplomacy is sort of trending, but I don't know if Asif would agree in that. But
I do. I do, but I would also differentiate. I mean, at the UN we call it the mediation of armed conflict, as opposed to peace diplomacy. To us sounds too general, too broad, too vague. But I wanted to make a point, listening to all of you, and to not repeat. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, but it's also important to say that yes, Norway is special. But then again, it's not special because there are other players who also act like this. So I think one has to have a certain sense of healthy self-regard, and of course in a domestic setting here. But at the same time, one should also recognize that there are other countries who are trying to do this as well, and they are also facing similar problems. But let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, in the sense that the brand works. Norway is trusted for a whole bunch of different reasons. But it's also trusted because it's a small country, doesn't threaten anyone, and there's a certain advantage to that. So there are big countries that practice diplomacy or diplomacy for peace in a way that's quite different. But there's a certain practice here that I think we should not forget and that we should not lose sight of, that it's quite important to retain. It's very easy to lose your first place position or your leading position in a certain field. I think we forget that before Norway got involved in the Middle East, for instance, let's say in the late 80s, after much discussion, etc., Sweden was a big player in the Middle East. And in the early 90s, with the change of government in Sweden, they decided to actually walk away from that role. And it's really when then Norway sort of filled the void. So countries sometimes change positions, change policies. And I would say, and I'm going to keep saying this during the next minutes, which is that I think it's an important position that Norway has staked out, and it's useful to maintain because it's not just about feeling good about oneself. It is about self-interest also. It gives Norway a certain prominence.
May I just follow up asking, how can you even keep track of all the actors in this field? Because when we speak of Norwegian peace diplomacy, some people might imagine, a solemn Norwegian traveling into a conflict area and starting to, mediate, facilitate. In practice, there are so many actors, often several parallel tracks and so on. How do you even navigate this from your perspective as a UN actor?
So I would say the one thing that we didn't mention earlier in terms of what sort of is a highlight of Norwegian policy in this area is that I think when it comes to different conflicts, if Norway is involved, it doesn't try and exclude others. That's not always the case. The mediation landscape now is more competitive, more crowded. Some actors are benign, some actors are not entirely benign, some actors are competent, some actors are not entirely competent. And I think we just have to take that as par for the course. Lots of countries want to get involved in it, or organizations want to get involved in it for different reasons. The important bit is you try and we always talk about how there should be better coordination amongst mediation actors, but the cliche, of course, is that everyone wants to coordinate, nobody wants to be coordinated. And so in a way, you treat that as part of the course, and you focus on the good, positive actors, and then you work with them. And I think a good example of this for Norway is in Colombia, where we work with other countries, and of course, Johan, you know this best, and much better than me. It worked with other countries, and eventually later worked with the UN also. So I think that's a very positive example.
Yeah, and we'll get to positive examples. Aisha, you raised your hand.
Oh, I just wanted to come back to what you said about like this sense of identity that we have, and I think that is equally crucial in the time we're in right now. Any discussion about Norwegian peace and diplomacy efforts are no longer restricted to the mighty few, but it's out in the open. And that has created a whole other set of challenges. And I think mostly for the practitioners of this craft, to try to talk about mediation efforts and peace diplomacy, contact diplomacy, conflict diplomacy in a way that resonates. And I think for a very long time, the flip side to the sort of mythical work that Norwegian diplomats are doing, the secrecy, has kind of backfired. So when something like the Epstein case happens, everybody's like, we knew something was wrong all along, right? So it's just taking this feedback from the population or from the public opinion seriously, even if I believe 80% of this criticism is not rooted in any insider knowledge of how this works. It's just, it's controversial enough to start living its own life. So this is where I believe that the practitioners of this craft need to be more proactive in trying to explain what this is, but also what it isn't. So basically, it's not always about peace agreements. Sometimes it's just making sure the right person receives the right information at the right time to avoid further escalation. So there are many nuances here, and I don't believe all of those should be confidential.
No. The parliament and the government made a significant effort last year in clarifying some of these basic issues through a white paper on Norwegian engagement in conflicts. It distinguishes between contact diplomacy, which is something you mentioned, informal facilitation, formal facilitation, and then engagement in processes led by others. And then there are also an area of other types of international diplomacy that is related to peace and conflict that can also be mentioned in a sort of gray area. But these are the ones that are mentioned as kind of the basic categories. Interestingly, it doesn't use the concept of mediation and often distinguishes Norway's approach from mediation. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How? Because we all think about it as fredsmekling, peace mediation.
Yeah, but mediation, mekling in Norwegian, although the nuances are there between English and Norwegian, but it refers to what we perceive more as a bit more hard-handed role for the mediator or the facilitator, as we prefer to say in Norway. And I think today this has become even more important because we are approaching something described as a multipolar world with many power centers. And what you also see, I would say there is a greater skepticism towards calling upon the Western mediator to fix things. I think it was interesting to see how President Modi of India reacted when President Trump claimed that he had negotiated an agreement between Pakistan and India, and he was willing to take sanctions and tariffs and whatever, just to say that this was not mediated by the United States. Because, as I mentioned before, parties want to own the solution. They can be happy to have a soft facilitator there, but they are less keen on having someone coming in and claiming this is the solution. Yeah.
By the way, on the PRIO website, PRIO comments, there's an interesting commentary by Kristoffer Lidén challenging this distinction between facilitation and mediation and saying that actually what they call facilitation has everything to do with mediation, and if they recognize that there are also things to be learned from literature on mediation as such. Asif, very briefly before we go to the examples, please.
Just on that, I think we take a big tent approach to this. So before this becomes a discussion about inside baseball and we all talk about terminologies and what is what, I think we look at mediation covering all of these. Facilitation, dialogue building, trust enhancing, in different ways, good offices above all.
Wonderful. Then we've come to the second question on examples of successes. So, can you try to give me an example of a success or two or three? I know this is a field veiled in secrecy, meaning that there are many things that it's not possible to really speak that concretely about. There are some very publicly known examples of successes or failures, other things you might need to address a bit more indirectly. But please, give it a try. Torunn.
Colombia is an obvious case in point, which has been much debated and discussed, and I think a case that is out there in the public, well known. The current government, often lists the agreement between the Spanish government and ETA. The Philippines, the Philippine government and the Moro Islamic Front. But as you said, there has been so much secrecy, so it's really difficult to know how successful Norwegian peace mediation or peace facilitation has been. I myself, I've been working for 2 decades now on the issue of women's inclusion in peace mediation and peace processes. And there I think Norway has played a very important role, which is often overlooked, not much debated. But those of us who are in this game, we know. And we know that Norway has really, in many instances, played a vital role in making sure that women are there at the table, or that they have been listened to, that they have been given the opportunity to provide input and feedback. Libya, South Sudan, Sudan now, Norway plays a very important role trying to facilitate women's participation. So I think this is an issue that should really, really be much more highlighted. Also building on what you said, the value-based peace mediation that Norway has been promoting for many, many years.
So Colombia is the obvious answer, but an answer where it's really a question whether Norway should really take credits for that result. Johan.
Yeah, no, I participated in the implementation of the agreement, and you sort of encourage us to be critical. But I think, one good thing with the FARC agreement was that it was to a large extent homegrown, in the sense that Colombian parties owned it. I'm talking again about this facilitation role for Norway, where we tried to support where it was necessary, also bringing in expertise on the many topics that were covered by the agreement. And actually also doing some long-term stuff, for instance, engaging the Colombian military forces during a period of 20 years, actually, preparing them for a role in this process, because they had a fundamental role, of course, in the demobilization and the ceasefire, etc. So they also participated together with FARC in the design of it. So from that point of view, I think it was a success, and it actually achieved an agreement. And as Asif mentioned too, that there was a great cooperation with the United Nations on this one. And we also tried to follow up a lot of these value things that are important, for instance, accountability. Then obviously when the implementation came, I saw very clearly how the parties would focus on the main thing, that was the demobilization and the handing in of the weapons, concentration of the troops, and other issues that were of great importance were put more on the back burner. And there the role of the international community, Norway together with the United Nations and other actors, we were pressuring, for instance, to keep the gender issue on the table. But we met a lot of obstacles, of course. And today, of course, there is a lot of criticism of the agreement because you had splinter movements from the FARC and But I mean, when it comes to the final result of all this, I would say that it definitely changed the security situation in Colombia, created a new atmosphere, but it didn't solve all the problems. And now you see in Latin America, not only in Colombia, a transformation of former political fights towards more criminality. And very much of these problems are due to the fact that the state did not have the ability to take care of the demobilized, and many of them were recruited actually by these organizations. So this just shows that it's a long-term effort, and I think it also kills a bit the myth about the white man coming out of the jungle with an agreement and everything is fine. I didn't mention him. No, but I mean this is an old myth. So that we have to get good. But I also will criticize the myth saying there is no peace. Det blir ikke noe fred. People have a very sort of black and white perception of this. And actually the small steps that can be taken are of great importance. They create a different atmosphere. Yeah. But yeah.
So then you start to dig into the question of what really is success in this field, and this seems to be a key question for the Norwegian public debate on whether it's worthwhile or not, right? Aisha?
Yeah, I mean, are we done with the successes? Because
No.
I want to come to the other side of things.
Please do. Failures are closely related to success.
No, I just think that there is no single agreement, peace agreement, that doesn't have nuances to it, where some things have gone very well, while other things have not gone so well. So I think, just to continue on the Colombia track, the agreement was signed, but it's still sort of soon in the history of a country and the history of reconciliation, you never have a guaranteed peace. And a very, very good example of that is our engagement in Afghanistan. This week marks 5 years since the Taliban control. When I was asked, I think it was in 2019, how I felt about the peace agreement between the US and the Taliban, we were all very optimistic. 7, 8 years later, and 5 years into the Taliban rule, it is very hard to make a compelling case for Afghanistan being a success if we do not solely focus on the security argument. Because, of course, there's no longer any war in Afghanistan. There are no bombs, there's no NATO troops, no Afghan soldiers dying left and right, no civilians dying left and right. But the absence of war, is that necessarily peace? Considering that despite, I mean, you highlighted value-based diplomacy, and I've been a poster girl for that for so many years. 1325, women around the table. Now women are completely they've vanished from the public. They haven't vanished because that's passive. They have been made to disappear.
You're entering the sphere of counterfactuals because in a fundamental problem with this field is that it's really hard to say what would have happened if you did not have the engagement, right?
Yes.
So usually we would then think about, okay, Norway engaged, and what would have happened without it? In Afghanistan, you had, as far as I have heard, Norwegian diplomats eager to facilitate talks with the Taliban at an earlier stage, where other actors insisted to go for the military solution. So that might be an example of a history that would have been different with more peace diplomacy. What's your take on that?
No, I completely agree. I just wanted to use the example that you never know whether something is a success in the moment an agreement is signed. For instance, Doha was signed, people were optimistic, and then we have now seen another example is all of us that believe in diplomacy and believe in every minister or political leader that says that we need to engage with everybody regardless of which side they're on. We have invited the Taliban to Norway, and we have, maybe what I'm trying to say is that we have to change the framing. Maybe we have to move away from the value-based to more realist and not say that, oh, we invited them here because the pragmatist may feel inspired after a trip to Oslo, because I don't see how these, I've seen how certain elements have been legitimized through these kind of invitations as well. So there's a duality. I mean, I'm not...
Indeed.
So it's...
I think we should embrace the complexity of these
Yes.
processes, which is that in some cases you are going to be able to make value-based processes work, and in some places you'll have to be absolutely realistic. And gauging that is the job of
Yes.
the mediator.
Yes.
But I think I would reframe the question. The success is not because of the mediator. Above all, success happens because of the conflict parties agreeing to come to an agreement. And so when we try and frame this, and I'm making this point because it's relevant to how what I hear the Norwegian public or people are asking questions, is that it's not about success of the mediator. This is a difficult business. Most peace agreements fall into disrepair or get violated with or have a relapse into war within 6 to 7 years, 2/3 of them. So I think the issue is more that we need to make a difficult, complicated argument when we talk about more visibility, to explain that this is a very difficult business, but it's a worthwhile business. And why is it worthwhile? Because whether you have comprehensive peace agreements, and I think, Johan, you're right that they are very much out of fashion right now. The last one I think we had was almost 10 years ago, is that even when you have a level of a complex ceasefire, for instance, they save lives. And the imperative in mediation, in humanitarian action, and a lot of what we do is ultimately about saving lives. It's not about grand design. In some places you can do more. In some conflicts, that's all you can achieve, which is that, for instance, Yemen before the present conflagration had a ceasefire that lasted 2 to 3 years, and it saved hundreds of thousands of lives. We never had a grand agreement. So I think gauging that and explaining it in a way that is not about, wow, Norway was a successful actor and now it's not. I think that would be too simplistic.
So then you're bringing us to the playing field of Norwegian peace diplomacy, which is the final question, right? And none of us have really addressed so far the big elephant in the room, the one with the big yellow hair, and how this elephant has been making peace around the world lately in disastrous settings. There's a changing international scene. The type of peace diplomacy that is described in the white paper I mentioned belongs to an era before that, but there's also lots of continuities. So one could also exaggerate the change in the international scene. So I guess this is another place where we need to introduce some nuance rather than saying, okay, it worked before, it's not going to work or be relevant anymore. Please help me understand where we are at this moment in terms of the peace diplomacy. Yes.
I think it's undeniable, and I think Haakon slightly referred to that in the beginning. It's undeniable that we are moving into a phase where there's going to be more war, more conflict, more insecurity in the world, thanks to conflict, geopolitical rivalries, greater levels of poverty. The world has not looked back since COVID. We are in much worse shape, even as development spending is going down. And then finally, of course, climate change. I think it's going to be a very complex, difficult agenda. And so the question always is to us, is our reaction going to be that we should do less of working on peace processes and working for peace, even as it is becoming very, very difficult? But I think this is about having stamina, staying in it for the long haul. It is not about spending huge amounts of money. I mean, the good news here is that this kind of diplomacy is, if you compare it to everything else, on the international domestic agendas is actually quite cheap, because it's about talking to people. It's not about big pieces of equipment and tanks and planes and, I don't know, infrastructure. And so I think it's worthwhile to do, but it is going to be against an extremely difficult landscape. But one final point, which is to say that I think we have this perception that now that the post-Cold War era is over, when we had 30 years of greater respect for human rights and more peace processes, and that it was and that before that there was a Cold War. The Cold War was not cold. large parts of the world were burning when the Cold War was carrying on, but there was some level of agreement between the US and Russia on the one hand, with the accompaniment of China, to allow a number of conflicts to end or for them to burn out. It's not as if things were that much better. And so we just have to, again, have a sense of realism about the fact that it's a very complicated, difficult world, as it always has been, and we need to press on. It's not just because it's a pious hope, but because I think it's the only prospect we have for trying to maintain or work towards peace. And obviously I work for the UN, so I fundamentally believe in that. But I think countries that are big upholders of multilateralism, like Norway, they need to stay the course.
I mentioned the US, Qatar, and Pakistan these days, Turkey, Egypt. There are other actors these days that fill the news in terms of being involved in these peace processes. Is that just a reflection of the conflicts that we speak of, or is it a reflection of a changing scene of peace diplomacy in general? Johan, you already asked for the word. I don't know if this is also something you could address. But
yeah, no, just to say that I agree very much with Asif, of course, that this is more relevant than ever, and not only because of the growing number of conflicts, but as you mentioned also, Asif, this issue of the global order. This is not only important to the parties, but it's important to Norway's security interests as well. And I think this argument needs to be put much stronger in the Norwegian debate as well. Because some have the idea that we are only concerned about the conflicts that are close to us. We should focus on Europe, which I very much agree. I mean, the support of Ukraine is very important, for instance. But what we underestimate is the impact of all these growing conflicts regionally that not only have a great, I mean, people talk about the gas prices in Norway, that's one with the Hormuz Strait, for instance. But I think the important thing here is if you let all these conflicts simmer, you contribute to the destruction of the world order, in a way, and to a brutalization, really, of the world as we know it today. So dealing with this, and it's difficult to deal with it, and we have to recognize that complexity. But there also we have to work with many different actors. And just a word on the United States, I think obviously this coercive and partly transactional diplomacy that they are following obviously is not one that we would go into, but I think what Norway and other actors can do is play important supplementary roles to try, for instance, to ensure that simply that the parties are heard, that they can participate in the solution. And we saw that, for instance, when the Board of Peace started its work on the Middle East, which important that they gave this impulse, but obviously in the beginning the Palestinians were not really taken into the room, so to speak, and I believe this gradually, also through efforts by different European countries and the UN, we've been able to get them on board and more on board. But still there is a balance there that still needs to be strengthened. So in all these processes there is a possibility, I think, to playing the little bit the repairman or the the one who can contribute to make these processes better, more inclusive, and try to add some of the value base we need here. But not reject that diplomacy offhand, because it can create impulses that are important. So, but to your question about, absolutely there are more actors and it's difficult to navigate, but I think the question here is to try to have close contacts with them. And that comes, and then comes the networking work, which is very important. Networking has also, unfortunately, in the Norwegian debate gotten sort of a bad name as sort of an elitist activity, but it's actually important gaining the insight on what others are doing and understand where they stand, and also look how we all can play a role in that.
Because we didn't really address that in the opening discussion in terms of who the actors here are. People could still be imagining peace diplomacy as only being carried out by diplomats networking over expensive dinners, involved in, dodgy networks, political networks, exchanging deals and calling it something with peace. Is that the world of peace diplomacy? Who are the actors that we're speaking of? Just very quickly before we pass to the last phase. Yes, Torunn.
Well, there's a number of private actors, like NGOs, involved in this business, increasingly so. But also, what I think is particularly interesting is the growing number of state actors. We see numerous countries or states in the Gulf. Switzerland has been in this business for a long time, but now also countries like Japan, very new in this business. And what is interesting, and it goes back to what Asif said about Norway, a particular trait about Norwegian peace diplomacy, that Norway is open and inclusive. They play a very supportive role also and collaborate with many of these new state actors. And we see this all the time. There are delegations coming to Oslo wanting to learn from Norway, and they come to PRIO to meet with us and to have us, provide our analysis of Norwegian peace diplomacy. So I find this quite interesting and fascinating. And also I agree with you, Asif. We should be more engaged rather than less. This is not expensive. Norway spends, 400 million Norwegian kroners on peace diplomacy and peace engagement, and it's the equivalent of 0.68% of Norway's budget for development cooperation. It's really nothing.
We've reached the final phase of this discussion, and I saw you asked for the word, but you'll have to integrate it into the final word, because you've been invited to give a maximum 1 minute take on the future for Norwegian peace diplomacy. And I'll start with you, Asif.
Great. I think we have to be real with the public that may or may not be listening and that is paying attention, and to the Norwegian Parliament. Far be it from me to say that, but I will say it anyway, which is that this work gives Norway influence, prestige, and entry around the world in a way that a country of 5.5 million people could only dream of. If you don't do this, you will not have that. I think that it's important, not because Norway is not an important country, but it's a modern, prosperous, economically advanced country that has strong democratic standards and a society. It has the space, it has the resources. It should continue to maintain the bandwidth to do this, because it's good for Norway and it's good for the international system.
Wonderful. Aisha.
Keep calm and carry on. And I say this because we talk about the world order, we talk about the United States, but we need to bring it down. This is also about the upending that has happened due to one man and his administration. America will not forever be Trump's America. Whereas our experience, our competency, our contacts, our networks are going to come in handy also after the next election. So again, keep calm and carry on.
Yeah.
Johan.
Yeah. No, I think very much agree with that, and that I think what we see also today is that the military solutions that stand alone do not give results. So I think the pendulum will swing back. There will be more insistence on diplomacy and the use of diplomacy. So we should carry on, work with this, give better explanations for what we are doing, and because we need to understand the public, and that this corresponds also with Norwegian interests and building international capital. Really, is what the question is here.
Perfect.
Yeah, I hope that Norway can be the least Klaveness of peace mediation. Someone who stands up for a certain set of values, even if in tough times, even if you're alone. I was at a panel yesterday where a representative from the Football Association said that Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, they are nobodies in FIFA, but Norway is somebody, because Norway has stood up for many, many years, being tough on rights and values. And this has paid off.
And now you have Holland.
Yeah.
The biggest peace mediator.
Yeah.
And on that silly note, I'll close this discussion. Thank you so much for your contributions to the discussion. I also see it as an invitation to a further debate in Norway, internationally, and at PRIO. So thank you all for coming. There's now, in 15 minutes, another discussion on diplomacy hosted by our dear friends Nubi, and I invite you all back to that on their behalf. Thank you.